All right, my friends, welcome back to Boozin on a Budget right here on Titan TV. Well, guys, it is the last episode of Season 1. Make sure that you stay tuned for the entire episode and drop a comment in the chat for your chance to win a $50 gift card to Amazon, courtesy of our producer, Nick. Thank you so much, Nick, for putting that up. Tonight, we're going to round out Season 1 by going back to my wheelhouse, and that is whiskey. Next to wine, probably my favorite thing to talk about. It goes back and forth whether I'm focused on whiskey or wine, but we're going to talk about whiskey tonight. We're going to talk different types of whiskey. We'll talk also about some whiskey culture type things, some sharing and some different things that have come about since whiskey has become so popular. We will also discuss how exactly to smell, taste, and drink whiskey if you're looking to get into it. Of course, we'll also do pairs with. We'll talk about a little bit of music as well. But right now, let's get into the different types of whiskey. Now, there's up to 17 different types of whiskey if you're gonna just look at all across the board, all across the world. I'm gonna focus on some of the ones that are the major players, the things you're most likely to run into in the store, the major players in the market, if you will. That includes American whiskey, which is bourbon, rye, and Tennessee whiskey, Scotch, single malt and blended, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, and Japanese whiskey. Let's start with bourbon. In order for whiskey to be labeled bourbon, it does have to follow a few things by law. First of all, it must be 51% corn in the mash bill, the grains that the liquor is fermented from, 51% corn. Then, to qualify as a bourbon, it must be aged in new charred oak barrels by law. And when it's bottled, it must be bottled at least 80 proof. No additives, no coloring, anything like that can go into your bourbon. It can never exceed 160 proof or 80 alcohol by volume. Also, it cannot exceed 125 proof when it first enters the barrel. Straight bourbons, when it says straight bourbon whiskey on the label, it must be aged at least 2 years. However, you can call it bourbon. There's actually no minimum age that is required to call it bourbon. Now, here's something that a lot of people get a little confused about. In fact, I was confused about it when I first started. I used to say, I'll admit, it has to come from Kentucky in order for it to be bourbon. It absolutely does not have to come from Kentucky to be labeled bourbon. You can make bourbon in Fallon, Nevada, hence Frey Ranch. Having said that, a ton of awesome bourbon comes from Kentucky, and it's argued that that's where it started. Some of the great bourbons that we know come from Kentucky, and really there is a ton of major producers, major distilleries that are located in Kentucky. A lot of that has to do with the water that they have. The water in the area in Kentucky comes down across limestone beds, some of their water, and one of the major components to making a great bourbon whiskey is the water that you add into the process. So that's why there are so many great whiskeys coming from Kentucky. Of course, it has, great history, great lineage. Again, tons of good bourbon come from Kentucky, but it does not have to come from Kentucky to technically be bourbon. Examples, just general, there's tons of bourbon whiskey, man, tons of them. But a couple examples of bourbon whiskey would be your Wild Turkey 101, your Jim Beam, your Maker's Mark, Evan Williams. Those are your baseline bourbons. Let's move along to Tennessee whiskey. It has to be made in Tennessee in order for it to be labeled Tennessee whiskey. That's because there is a particular style in Tennessee, a particular process that it goes through. While the blend of the mash isn't subject to any special requirements, they do not have to be 51% corn in the mash bill or anything else. It does have to go through a charcoal filtering process, which is called the Lincoln County process. That is what makes Tennessee whiskey Tennessee whiskey. Examples of Tennessee whiskey, Jack Daniels and your George Dickel. And some others, but those are your most well-known Tennessee whiskeys. Let's talk about rye. Rye whiskey, very similar to bourbon, but it is a different animal. In order for it to be labeled rye whiskey, it has to have at least 51% rye, the rye grain, in the mash bill. A lot of rye whiskeys have 100% rye in the mash bill. Your ryes, very similar again to your bourbon. However, they're a little bit spicier and a little bit less sweet. Give a rye a try. I really like rye as well. I'm going to be honest. I'm just going to let the cat right out of the bag. There are plenty of ryes, and maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe my palate's not advanced, but they taste very similar to bourbon to me. And if you line some up, I'm not sure I'd be able to pick them apart. Definitely they are spicier. There is a little bit of rye spice thing happening in there, but if you are used to bourbon, if you can drink bourbon, give rye a try as well. All right, let's move along to Scotch whiskey. Man, I went through a crazy Scotch period of my life, like 2 years, where I was drinking nothing but Scotch, and I fucking loved it. I know I will get back to a Scotch period again. I'm like still going nuts over bourbon. It's interesting. I started in bourbon, went to Scotch, stopped drinking Scotch, and then went back to bourbon. But Scotch whiskey must be distilled, aged in oak casks for at least 3 years, and bottled in Scotland. Scotch comes from Scotland. It usually comes from one of the 5 distinct regions of the country, including the Lowlands, Highlands, Islay, Speyside, and Campbelltown. Each one has its unique kind of style. If you're trying to get into Scotch, I would highly recommend not going for an Islay. Go for a Speyside. Speyside is not going to have as much of that smoky flavor that Scotch is known for. That smoke flavor really puts a lot of people off. Not all Scotch is smoky. Start with your Speyside. The intense aroma, a lot of the ones that do have that smoky flavor, comes from peat. They literally burn peat in the malting process of the grain, and that's where some of that really heavy smoky flavor comes from in Scotch. Now, a lot of Scotch is blended, but there are a ton of single malt Scotch. If you really get into it like I was, I didn't really drink a lot of blends. There were a couple blends. Monkey Shoulder is a really great blend. In fact, if you're looking to try to get into Scotch, I would highly recommend Monkey Shoulder, a blended Scotch whiskey. However, these Scotch snobs, they will only drink single malt Scotch. So let's talk about that. I used to think single malt wouldn't mean, it comes from one malt. It does, but that's not what the single stands for. Single in single malt Scotch stands for it comes from a single distillery, as opposed to a blend, which can come from several distilleries and blend them together. So single distillery, malt is barley. It's 100% barley. Your single malt Scotch, 100% comes from malted barley. And that's where your Scotch aficionados land. Macallan. Here are some examples of single malt Scotch. Macallan, Glenlivet, Lagavulin, Glenmorangie, Laphroaig. Laphroaig, incredibly peaty, smoky Scotch there. Try the Monkey Shoulder if you're trying to get into it. Also, other good beginner Scotch would be the Glenlivet and the Glenmorangie. Let's move now to Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey was originally the work of Irish monks, who were among the first to distill alcohol from grain. Likely, though, their first distillates came from wine. Makes sense. The distilling process usually involves 3 separate runs. They distill the liquor, distill it again, and distill it again, kind of higher quality each time. And they use, a lot of times the Irish whiskey is using copper pot stills. This creates an exceptionally silky product that ages for at least 3 years in a wooden cask. Examples of Irish whiskey include Jameson, Bushmills, Powers. People are very familiar with those, with Jameson especially. A lot of Jameson being drank in the United States. Let's move now to Canadian whiskey. Canadian whiskey. It has to be made in Canada, obviously. The entire mashing, distilling, and aging process takes place in Canada. Like some other whiskeys, it ages in wooden barrels for 3 years at a minimum, sometimes more, but the barrels can only be a maximum of 700 liters, no larger. So they go in some smaller casks and barrels. And the resulting whiskey must also be at least 40% alcohol by volume, so 80 proof. Most Canadian whiskeys are a variation of blends with a relatively high amount of corn and some rye in the mash bill, as well as a mixture of high proof grains and lower proof whiskeys. So Canadian whiskey is generally known to be blended. It's generally known to not really have a whole lot of distinct characteristics that make it Canadian whiskey, so it's very popular for blending. Nothing against Canadian whiskey. I've had some absolutely phenomenal Canadian whiskey, but it generally is not quite as unique. In my opinion, I guess. That may be an opinion thing. Examples of good Canadian whiskey: Crown Royal, Canadian Club, and Seagram's. I'll tell you what, Crown Royal's not bad at all. I have drank Crown Royal and I think it's absolutely decent for Canadian whiskey. Lastly, one of the last major players would be Japanese whiskey. Japanese whiskey has a global market share now, like some of the bigger, more traditional American and European varieties. The makers of Japanese whiskey, they didn't reinvent the wheel. Rather, they import many of their ingredients from Scotland, and their manufacturing process usually looks pretty similar to that of Scotch. Most Japanese whiskey distilleries make exclusively single malt varieties, and they have a more subtle peat flavor, a little more subtle smokiness than that of Scotch. I haven't drank a lot of Japanese whiskey. I just haven't got there yet. I know some people rave about them, and they're definitely on my list to try, but I haven't got there yet. Something cool here, Japanese makers have decided they're trying to get their industry dialed in, get a little more technical. So they have decided that by the year 2024, all Japanese whiskey must meet these following specific requirements: that they are aged, fermented, distilled, and bottled in Japan, made with Japanese water. Again, water is a huge part of the process. The Japanese take that water part very seriously, which is why they have some very high quality spirits that come from there. Aged at least 3 years and contain malted grain. Examples of Japanese whiskey include Suntory Toki, Nika, and Hibiki. The Hibiki Harmony, people rave about that one. Give it a try. I should go and I should spring for a bottle of Japanese whiskey, because what am I doing here? I haven't even tasted Japanese whiskey. Get it together! One last thing before we move on to the next segment. I thought this was interesting. It's the spelling of whiskey. For American and Irish whiskey, we spell it Whiskey. For Scotland, Canada, and Japan, they leave the E out. They spell it Whisky. So that's interesting. However, there's no laws around this piece of it, so I think it might be Maker's Mark that spells it with no E. I don't know. It's just one of those things. So American whiskey, your bourbons, they're going to have the EY spelling. All right, my friends. Next, I wanted to talk about some of the culture that has sprung up from our now 5 to 7 year fascination with bourbon. It has really just taken off. It's become a phenomenon. People are searching it out and collecting it and going just absolutely nuts for it. Standing in lines that go all the way around the building at distilleries just to be the first ones in to get their hands on certain bottles. People are going nuts for it. But it's created a pretty cool culture, society, brother and sisterhood, if you will. So, bottle sharing. A lot of times people will say, hey, I can't get this bottle in my neck of the woods, in my part of the country. I'm going to Zelle you or whatever, Venmo you. Will you send me a bottle? Yeah. People are sending bottles all over. I know there are some laws, that determine what states you can do that in, but I'm going to say most whiskey people don't give a shit and they'll just send it wherever. So they're sharing and sending bottles all over the country, helping people to taste stuff that they can't get in their area. Also, people are having big parties. It's called a bottle share party, where I'll come over with a nice bottle that I have, and everybody brings a bottle to the party, and then we all sample each other's bottles. Another way to try a bunch of stuff that you may have never had before. Also, handshakes. These little sample bottles, and I got some off of Amazon I got 12 of them for like $11 or something. People will fill these up and send them to their mail, go meet up at their favorite liquor store, whatever, and they trade handshakes. I just did this recently for the first time with a guy I met on Instagram who's also into whiskey. He said, let's trade some handshakes, some little samples. So I actually poured him 4 samples. I poured him 4 samples of bottles that I had. He poured me 3 that he had that I don't have. So we traded. Now he's tasting some stuff that I have in my collection, and I'm tasting some stuff that he has in his collection. Pretty cool. But you see these little handshakes talked about all the time on TikTok, on Instagram. People are sending these around. This whole community has been created out of bourbon, and generally most people, they're excited to share and they're excited to help people experience this stuff. It's really cool. This one, you can say it's cool or not, but it has developed like a whole secondary or black market for whiskey. Let's say there's a bottle that I can't get. There's like, Pappy Van Winkle. Those bottles are extremely hard to come by. So sometimes people that are in, Kentucky or wherever they're a little bit more abundant will get those, and then they just literally sell them on the black market, secondary market. Sometimes it's a good thing because they're helping people to buy bottles that they can't get. Other times they're taking it and they're jacking the price way, way up so that they can make a profit on selling it on the secondary market. So take that for what it is, but that is another piece of the culture that has come about, literally a black market for whiskey. All right, guys, welcome to my next segment, Binge Thinking. On Binge Thinking today, I want to talk about and give you some tips and advice on how to actually smell, taste, and drink whiskey. I hear this an awful lot where people, number one, they're like, there's no way you're tasting all this stuff in whiskey. Every time I taste whiskey, it just burns and it's terrible. I'll do a shot, but that's it. You're lying when you're saying that you're tasting all these different flavor notes and smelling all this cool stuff. Also, a lot of people will say, like, I don't know how you drink that, man. How in the hell do you sit there and sip whiskey? That stuff makes my face pucker up and it burns going down, and I just don't get it. So there are some tips. Let's start with smelling. If you're really serious about getting into experiencing whiskey on a different level, you want to get yourself a tasting nosing glass. This is called a Glencairn. It's a Glencairn glass. It has a specific shape to draw those odor compounds up to the top so that you can get your nose in there and really give it a good smell. Also, this solid piece of glass on the bottom is so that you can hold the glass there and not have your hands touching the whiskey so that you don't warm it up too much. You don't want to warm it up, really past room temp either. So the way that I smell whiskey, just like wine, you can give it a little swirl. That's gonna like open it up a little bit as well as bring those aroma compounds up. So give it a swirl and then stick your nose in. That's got a real toasted nuttiness going on. Be careful. Sometimes you're just gonna get that ethanol, that alcohol blast to your nose. So if you do stick your nose in, you don't want to leave it in there and just inhale over and over and over. Then the alcohol will literally make your nose go numb. So give it a quick sniff. Or what I really like to do is what you just saw me doing, going back and forth with my nose. Oh, cake batter. See, I'll exhale too a lot of times. I don't know exactly what that does, but for me it works. Toasted pecans in like butter and brown sugar. Here's a nosing technique, a way to cleanse your nose. Smell yourself. You're very used to smelling yourself, so you can readjust your nose by smelling yourself. Go back in. Oh. Waving it around, letting it come out. Take your time smelling it. I mean, smelling whiskey is almost as pleasurable as tasting it. Wow. Smelling whiskey, take your time. It's almost as pleasurable as tasting it. Now, before we go into the sipping part, I want to highly recommend, if you're starting out, if you're new to this, go for those lower proof bourbons to start out because they're going to be less volatile on your nose and your palate. So if you're trying to get your palate adjusted to whiskey, you want to start with something lower on the proof, like 80 proof. You're not going to find much lower than 80 proof. So get you a nice 80 proof whiskey. That's a great place to start. It's not going to be as volatile to your palate as some of the higher proof stuff. You can work your way into the higher proof stuff. Now, when I go to sip, I'm not going to fill my whole mouth up to begin. I'm going to take a nice sip. I don't want to take too little, but I don't want to take too much. I want to take enough that I'm going to let it roll around my palate, roll all around my tongue. That's going to just coat my tongue and let that flavor kind of sink in. Another thing, guys, you want to, especially if you're learning, especially if you're getting into it, let that whiskey kind of get acquainted with your saliva. It will kind of dilute the whiskey a little bit, make it a little less harsh going down. Let it sit in there. Let it get involved with your saliva. Another thing that people do is called a Kentucky chew. They literally get the whiskey in their mouth and they chew, chew, chew. That's just going to really, really get your tongue saturated with that whiskey, which is a great way to taste it. And again, if you're looking to reduce some of the harshness, let it sit in your mouth a little bit. Let it mix with your saliva before you swallow it down. And then when you do swallow it, don't go gulp and swallow like hard. Let it kind of swallow nice and smooth and let it roll down your throat. Let's go in for a taste. I always smell before I taste, but... Pay attention to what it's doing after you swallow. Breathe in through your nose and your mouth. Pay attention to how long that flavor lingers in your mouth before it goes away. A telltale sign of a quality whiskey is that those flavors don't immediately disappear. If you swallow whiskey and it's gone, that's a telltale sign of a lower quality whiskey. You want them to hang around for a while. In fact, the longer that you're still tasting the whiskey on your palate after you've swallowed it, goes for wine as well. That's what you're looking for, the better the product. If those flavors are lingering around for a solid 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute or longer, you have a great product. This one's still hanging on. Another tip or trick, add a few drops of water, literally like drop, like couple drops. That will help it to be a little bit less harsh and help your palate get used to it. Also, put it on some ice. Try that. The ice will dilute it a little bit, cool it down, help it to be a little bit easier to take in. The ice won't really help with the flavor, in my opinion, because I think it closes it up. Let's just say, though, a few drops of water, some ice, it will help us experience the different angles of the whiskey. So try it neat, try it with some water, try it with some ice. Get your palate developed, and it's not going to be easy at the beginning. Just keep on tasting it. Taste different whiskeys. Taste that lower proof stuff. Keep on going. I promise your palate will get used to it. You'll break through what they call the wall. You will be on your way to sipping whiskey like a pro. All right, guys, let's move on to the drink of the week. I have been using this Still Austin tonight. It is a cask strength. I think I had a Still Austin bottle earlier in the season. This is from Texas. This is another grain to glass product like the Frey Ranch, in that they grow the grains, distill the liquor, barrel it, and age it. The entire company does all of those things, and so it's from grain to glass. So it's a smaller producer. I love these smaller producers. Still Austin. There's a couple different Still Austin offerings. The Musician is a wonderful bourbon that I really, really like from them. This is Still Austin cask strength. What is cask strength? It means they took it right out of the bottle. They didn't proof it down with water. So this is 59% alcohol by volume. It is 118 proof. Probably not the one you want to start out with sipping if you're a newbie. However, if your palate is adjusted to it, you start to really get into the higher proof stuff because they haven't added water. There's actually just a ton of flavor in the higher proof stuff. Again, this one from Texas, distilled and bottled by Still Austin Whiskey Company in Manor, Texas. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Manor, Texas. Certified Texas whiskey. This one's only aged 2 years. It is a bourbon and it is barrel proof. I highly recommend the Still Austin stuff. I really, really like it. The Musician, I believe they have a rye as well. But this one is just wonderful. I was drinking it the other night and it had a very strong kind of peach flavor note going on. It's packed with flavor. It's super good. It's very nice, thick color on there. I love their bottles. Of course, they're in Austin, Texas. Well, Manor. I'm not sure how close that is to Austin, but some of their marketing, revolves around that music that's happening in Austin, Texas, a place where I have to go. It's definitely on my list of places to go. But find some Still Austin. Start with the Musician or the rye, or if you have an experienced palate, get you some cask strength. Really, really like what Still Austin is doing with their whiskey. All right, guys, lastly, we'll go into my segment, Pairs With. We're going to finish with another album that just dropped. This one a little different. It is from an artist named Carol G. She is a Hispanic artist. Over, I'd say, the last year and a half, I've really got into reggaeton. Love reggaeton. I speak a little Spanish. I understand a little Spanish. So I'm hoping that as I listen to reggaeton, some of that Spanish will just transfer into my subconscious. However, like, I got bit by the reggaeton bug and I can't get enough. In fact, I think reggaeton is just busting into more of the mainstream anyways. Some of these Hispanic artists are kind of taking over. Look at the year that Bad Bunny has had. He's gone completely nuts. But Carol G, check her out. The album is called Mañana Será Bonita, Tomorrow Will Be Beautiful. It's very emotional. It's got the reggaeton, but this isn't like a party album. This is kind of like an emotional, nice reggaeton. There are some more upbeat songs, and I'm not putting it down at all. I've read a little bit her title, Mañana Será Bonita, Tomorrow Will Be Beautiful, that some of this album covers some of the darker times, in her as an artist, as a person. So some of that is felt in the album, but it's really good. Check out reggaeton if you haven't. I'm super into it. I love my reggaeton. Her album features Shakira, Sean Paul, Romeo Santos, and Angel Dior, among others. So give it a try. Give reggaeton a try. Carol G. Check her out. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining me on season 1 of Boozin' on a Budget. What a fun ride we have had. We've tried some excellent wines, whiskeys, beers. The seltzer episode is awesome. If you haven't seen that, or if you haven't seen any of the episodes, you want to go back, check some of the ones you missed, rewatch your favorites, you can always do so at the Titan Media Collective YouTube page. So go back and revisit some of the past Boozin' on a Budget episodes. Guys, remember, drink in moderation. Take your time to research, study a little bit, learn a little bit about what you're drinking. I promise that it will enhance your experience. Push yourself outside of your boundaries. Go talk to people. Go get involved. You will have a much greater experience of your alcoholic beverages. I promise you that. Thank you guys so much, and good night. Thank you for joining me on Boozin' on a Budget, and we will see you next time. Have a good night, guys.